Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel for another episode of Auto Heterophiles. Today I'm here with Skyler, who is a transitioner of autogynephilic etiology. You guys may have seen her interviews with Benjamin Boyce, or perhaps her appearances on the Dollcast. She's been doing interviews, and it's great for AGP optics because she's likable and reasonable, and she literally looks like a woman. It's great. So thank you for coming on the channel, Skyler.
Oh, Phil, you're so flattering. No, in all honesty, I believe in truth, and I believe in in helping people really in this space. I think gender issues, like on a personal note, are some of the toughest issues a person can experience. And I think that just honesty matters. Truth matters a lot. And I believe in what you're doing. And I think I woke up a little bit more to the value of what your project is when I saw the discussion with Stella and Sasha you recently that was recently aired on the Wider Lens podcast, the Gender Wider Lens podcast.
Yeah. How'd you feel about that one?
Oh, I thought it was good. I mean, overall, I thought the dynamics were just like so illuminating to watch, because they really push back on you, and Stella hit with some very conventional criticisms from what I've seen. And full disclosure, I have not finished the video yet, so there's still more that I have to see. I think I made it like 45 minutes, 50 minutes in, but it woke me to the fact that there is a very limited view of what I consider autosexuality, in terms of like how it manifests and how it operates, and just the pushback to it even being considered a sexuality was somewhat a little bit eye-opening to me, because I just sort of took it for granted that of course people can experience inverted target location error. Like, this is definitely a phenomenon that can happen just by seeing people act out different sorts of identities and whatnot. And then to see like, oh no, this is getting some real big pushback from these really, quite frankly, therapists that I have sort of admired their work, really was like, oh, okay, like there seems to be a little bit of a limited understanding here. And I can see some incentives as to why. But that's where I think adding the value to the discourse of just, being on your show is important.
What sort of incentives do you think they might have for
Well,
their
I think,
stances?
yeah, right. Like, what are those incentives? And I think their project, I don't want to say this conclusively, because they do technically say that anyone in their gender framework document, and it was released when I was at Genspect and Denver. I think a preview of it, or maybe the official one was, I can't recall exactly, but I remember one of the takeaways was like, if you're over 25, that transition can be like, it can be something you do, but essentially their viewpoint is that transition is like it's just negatively viewed from their perspective, like heavily so, because they have this whole framework structured around not transitioning, which was really the point, I think, of their therapeutic guidance in this document, which is, I think, absolutely needed, and is much better than the gender affirming care approach. But I do think that if there's a sexuality at play, there's an endogeneity and a consistency that's sort of at root here for this individual. If this is true, right? If it's connected to sexuality. And so then the question becomes, is that if you can't change sexuality, how do you manage this? And that's sort of where I think there's an incentive on their part to not say it's so clear cut as a sexuality. And it's sort of this, I don't know, this, yeah, I don't know, a disorder is sort of what comes to my mind when they were explaining, like, well, if you are attracted to yourself as the opposite sex and you're actually in love with that version of yourself, that's a disorder. And I do think there's, I mean, sure, you can look at it from that viewpoint, but the fact is that if it's an experience that you're sort of wired this way too, then you're left dealing with that regardless.
Right. Who cares
Um,
if it's a disorder? Like, you are
yeah,
experiencing it. Yeah.
right.
No, I mean, I noticed. I think their hesitance about considering it a sexuality. I think they as therapists want to think that there's more that can be done. That
Hmm.
there's more potential to influence the outcomes, and that proper therapy or other non-medical interventions can have significant sway. And
Hmm.
the idea that most of this is hardwired and it's outside of your control, they don't want to hear that.
Yeah,
That's sort of like what I think the core opposition is, besides the sort of gender critical political stuff.
right. Yeah, I think so. And to further extend on that, though, I think there's a good bit of evidence that sort of supports their perspective in a way. And that's the diversity of what autosexuality presents as. Because if there's anything I've learned, it's that inverted sexuality may be the core unifying element across all these autosexual presentations, AGP presentations, whatever have you. But there's so much psychological diversity in how people are explaining it and what they're like, I don't know, rationalizing around it. And like ultimately the basically like there's just such a variety. There's such a variety. Um that it becomes difficult to be like prescriptive, and you wouldn't want to prescribe, say like, oh, you're autosexual or you're AGP or whatever. And then that automatically means transition. Like they don't want to be too prescriptive in that. So there's like a risk.
Right. Right. Which I think, yeah, they have that fear, even though like I never explicitly say that, like, hey, if you're AGP, that you therefore have to transition. It's because I take a neutral stance that it's like it's very individual. There's a lot of factors that go into that decision. Like
That's true.
passability, for
Yeah.
instance. You know.
You do. Yeah. No, I think that's where I really like your book, because you lay it out in a very rational viewpoint of like cost benefit analysis on those hypotheticals, and which with transition, there's almost endless hypotheticals. So I think is,
Right.
yeah, well spelled
Yeah.
out.
Like when you were pondering transition, like it it took up a lot of your thought space, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I mean, I had long thought and pondered on transition um in terms of that I wanted something to solve this gender conflict in myself, the gender dysphoria conflict. Um, and it became very real when I was out of college and I was getting ready to get married. And that sort of put the pressure, the impetus to, hey, I got to figure something out here. And by that point, I was long dysphoric about certain things in my body, especially my body hair. That was like a big one. My facial features, the increasing masculinization over time, because testosterone is cumulative, and so just life. You live life, and you progress in one direction or another. And if you don't intervene, you get progressively masculinized. Um,
Mhm.
and sort of waking up to this reality really put pressure on me to make some decisions. um I never really saw transition as a great option, to be perfectly honest. It was a last option in my viewpoint, because I felt like I just felt like there were a lot of themes in the stories of detransitioners that showed that it wasn't what they hoped for. Um, and I guess like, I could tell that some of those stories were very much of fellow, autosexual type dysphoric people. And so I would be left kind of questioning myself, well, am I going to be one of those people?
Did you know about the typology when you were contemplating transition?
Yes. Oh yeah, through and through. Mm-hmm.
And how did that influence your decision-making process?
Yeah. Well, so I guess I should go back to when I first found out about the typology and
Yeah.
why it clicked with me versus other explanations. Um, and I think the starting point is well, when I was 8 years old, I had fantasies, I had dreams of being a girl and hooking up with different partners, different people. They were always abstract. They weren't people I knew, but it was just like weird dreams like that. And when I said I was 8 years old, sorry, that was when I was 12, 13 years old. When I was 8 years old, I was just dreaming of being a girl and having really pleasant dreams like that, which were surprisingly, they were not sexual in any way. That all comes in the teenage puberty years. But I did feel like something was wrong with me in terms of my sex. Um, and and this is not like, I know a lot of autosexuals will like retcon or whatever it's called, where you like, lie about your
Yeah.
past conveniently or whatever. Um, no, this is totally through and through true, and it's that I actually prayed to God to turn me into a girl. But I wanted it to be done in a way that like it was like a magical pill switch. Like I was always born a girl, and there wasn't like one day my parents knew I was a boy and now they know I'm a girl. Like I wanted it to just be a clean switch. Um, and I knew that wouldn't happen, but it didn't stop me from praying about it. Um, and it wasn't like a consistent experience every single night that it was like this, but there were moments where it would really peak and I would do a lot of praying and then it would just kind of ebb into the background. And this was sort of the way it was until I was 13, 12, 13, when I got the talk, the birds and the bees talk, began learning about human sexuality a little bit more, about what it's for, what it happens. And around the same time, I also started having like, um, I guess, quote unquote wet dreams, sort of thing, that happens with testosterone and my body's changing and whatnot. But I wake up to this realization that I am always imagining myself as a girl when I'm having these dreams. And like, what's going on with that? Why do I appear as a girl in these dreams? And um, well, it wasn't just dreams. It was any type of activity I would need to do this. This was sort of like my way of engaging in my own sexuality. I had to project the image of myself as female. And well, the internet was around, but it was AOL at my house. So it was a dial-up connection. And I remember this was around like 2007, 2008 or so. And I just went online and I looked up this phenomenon. I was like, well, what does this mean that I have this experience of that? Like, I deeply want to be a woman and there is an underlying sexual component to it. And there's also numerous emotional components, but these emotional components had not matured. That's, I think, a key thing I realize now. But they were definitely there.
What kind of search queries did you make to solve this mystery?
Phil, I wish I could tell you.
Okay.
I honestly have no idea what I searched. But I came across Blanchard's typology somewhere. And I realized upon reading it that, okay, I fit this, AGP, autosexual component of the typology. And honestly, I dreaded it. I hated it. And I
That's a
still
common first reaction.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to think that the source of my dysphoria is fueled, prominently by this is, I mean, it's inconvenient at best, and at worst, I don't know, it's easy to have a denialist relationship towards it and be like, no, that's not it. Or just reinterpret the phenomenon in a way that's more flattering or more suitable for what, what you want it to be. I mean, more convenient. And so that was very much how I reacted. And I was denial. So I was in denial of it. I was like, oh God, I think this is me, but I'm not, but like I'm not gonna like deal with it. Like I'm not gonna go forth and like tell my parents, oh, this is me, and like try to like do something about it. I was just like, it's not that big of a deal in my life, and I can just keep it in a compartment down below and like just kind of shove it in a box and just be like, well, whenever I'm experiencing bisexuality, I can always imagine myself as the opposite sex fairly easily because I have a vivid imagination. And I can just work around it that way, because it would have been really hard to have brought this forward in any sort of grounded, sensible way to my parents, as I was growing up in a conservative Christian household.
Right. You probably made the right decision to keep that one to yourself for a while.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was out of self-protection in a way, even though they love me and I love them. It just wouldn't have served anyone, and it wouldn't have served me at the time either. I wasn't looking to transition. I mean, I was very happy with myself overall. It wouldn't be until years later that I would be like, okay, there's seriously something wrong here. Something I neglected to say is that before I uncovered any of this typology research or anything like that, I had some strange proclivities as a young boy, where I would go outside and imagine and pretend to myself for hours, embodying different characters, different figures that I mostly see in like TV or movies. And I'd step into these imaginary worlds and take on these personas and just entertain myself for hours. And when I say hours, I mean no joke. Like, this was such a serious thing that my parents thought about like intervening and taking me to a therapist or like somebody that could like figure out why I do this. And they were actually a little worried when I wasn't really growing out of it by like age 12. But eventually I did. It just kind of merged into this habit I sometimes have of talking to myself. But I did this so much that, I mean, I would turn away. I have 3 younger brothers, and I would literally not play games with them because I would have a preference to go just imagine by myself and walk around outside around the house, forgetting really about where I am physically and just immersing myself in this very vivid, rich imaginary world, where the important part was embodying and taking on different characters, girls and guys.
Oh, you would imagine yourself as a guy sometimes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah, because it has to be, it's integral for playing the full story.
Okay. Was this just like really advanced daydreaming? Sort of like the maladaptive daydreaming subreddit?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with that. There's some people are just trapped in daydreams all day.
Oh, yeah. I think it was like I was tapping into it. I'll tell you when that there was a concept you wrote about in your book. And ultimately the concept was the mental shifting.
Yeah.
And that one stuck with me, and I felt like, oh my gosh, that was what it seems like I was doing. Just not in a sexual context, but just in a I don't know, I'm bored and I want to entertain myself context. Like, that was literally about as much as I could like take away from what I was doing. But I actually now think that it was connected to wiring up my sexuality. Something I took away from actually from the Navel Gaze podcast was this concept of obligate AGP. And I think that pretty much summarized me pretty well, where it was like, this is the primary mode of how I experience sexuality, and has been since puberty for me. where this projection of myself as female is like literally necessary to go any further in terms of sexual activity. And I don't know
Right.
how
For like
prominent
sex to
that
make
is, but
sense, right?
yes. Yeah, for it to make sense. It's like the gateway
Yeah.
that I have to pass through. Hmm. Um, and I found that out very much like in my face when I had my first girlfriend, which I describe in the Benjamin Boyce interview, where it's the first time I'm ever getting physical with someone, and I had to do that. I had to like close my eyes and project like myself first, disassociate a little bit from the current moment, but not too much to where it's like, I don't know, robbing me of the experience. And then I was able to kind of go forward. Um, oh, it's kind of like hard to talk about because it's like so personal, but it's just true. And this is where I think like I see the pattern, I should say, emerge from this, that like essentially, I think the well, I know there's like, okay, I'm rambling a little bit, but I know been learning more that there's like AGP and there's AGAMP and there's all these different um
Right. We're always making new categories.
yeah, making new categories. Um yeah, and I just think like uh well, I was thinking about like where am I in the categories, and I'm like I feel like I'm a foot in each. And it's so weird because I don't know. It feels like more people have been like, oh, I'm in this category, I'm in this category. But for me, it's like I feel like I have a foot in each because I can be happy with myself in like I guess the AGAMP side is the one that's like I'm okay with the fact that I still have my male genitalia, but I have all this feminization, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, I would be very happy to get rid of that male genitalia and just be as close to an anatomical representation of female as possible. Um, but I've sort of made peace with the fact that I think my relationship with my current partner is better served by me keeping that, um, by me keeping my body as intact as possible,
Yeah.
and also by just the fact that the procedure itself is fraught with risks. Um, that I'm quite frankly nervous to even consider it.
Right. Because it's like the option isn't like whether to have a penis or a vagina. It's whether to have like a penis or like an approximation of a vagina that's like reconfigured penis in a way
Hmm.
where it's like even it doesn't really fully like give you what the wish is for, you know?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's like there's always gonna be some dissatisfaction even if you like technically do go like all the way, so to speak.
right. Yeah, exactly. And that's what really got me to put the brakes on that. And also the stories of so many detransitioners highlight
Yeah.
that particular surgery, that it's like almost to the point where it's like I get the sense that they may not even regret their transition at all. It's just that procedure that,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. And when you see that, it really opens your eyes like, well, I should really think twice about this.
Yeah, for sure. I know like in Anne Lawrence's book, I think she basically says that she doesn't think people should get it unless they have no other option. It's some sort of
Hmm.
wording like that where it's like don't do it unless it's you literally need to.
Right. Yeah. And I fully support that because there's too many. I mean, there's some seriously negative outcomes that come out of it. So, can come out of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also hard to know with like how often it goes well and to what extent because when you see say like on Reddit you see the people discussing the surgery and their outcomes, it seems implausibly positive what they're describing as the outcome where it's just like oh it like functions perfectly fine, it causes them no pain and they're able to have sexual relations really easy and it's no problem at all and it seems like it's not a truthful representation of the situation.
I get that same feeling too. I mean, going back to the Genspect conference, I got to meet Shapeshifter.
Right.
Um, yeah, in person. I'd
Yeah.
already seen their content on YouTube a couple times.
Right. The
But I
one
feel
like
like,
HSTS at the conference,
yeah,
I would
yeah,
say.
pretty much, yeah. Um, Wonderful person though. I really enjoyed being around her. Um, and yeah, and I just feel like the story though is really unilaterally focused on, this procedure is tricky. There's a lot of problems that can happen, and for in this case, that individual, it was completely negative and um, not a good one. So um, I don't know, just something about being there in person with Shape really hit home on that reality that wow, this person's here, and it's probably a lot to do with that particular surgery. So
Right. Yeah. No, I bet if they didn't have vaginoplasty, they would have not gotten involved in the whole detransition scene.
definitely, yeah, that's sort of. I mean, I don't want to say it concretely that that wouldn't have happened, but I will say that it seems like that is part of it.
Yeah. Something something that's funny about the sort of the controversy that happened afterwards is that like in that picture of me and Laura that like was spread around a bunch, there's you and Shapes in the background in a conversation, and
Yeah.
it's it's just funny that people were getting really mad about like the AGP there when it's like there's one or more other AGPs in the frame as well, but people don't recognize it as that because it doesn't fit their conception of it.
hmm
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, something I really liked about like I was glad to meet you at the conference. I know when I met you, I was it part of the joy is like, oh my god, like there are some people, some AGPs that can transition and then pass and actually like live as a woman because like statistically that's not common. Um, so it's like nice to see like the dream, so to speak, be reality. So I was like, and the fact that you were like that you had read my book and were being positive about it was great because like I'm always hoping for there to be more um, AGPs or autosexuals or whatever label we want
hmm
for them to like understand their situation and be open to talking about it without sort of like being all neurotic and bent out of shape about it. Um,
Yeah. I know. Yeah, I think there's a narrative that serves the transsexual community that distances AGP and is like, well, those are those, fetishistic cross-dressers or whatever. The distancing is there. That's not me. I'm a real woman. I'm a real trans woman. Type of thing. And there's this desire to create that distance because it otherwise threatens the political project of trans rights to a certain extent. If you have bad actors in kind of embedded in your cause that are, or perceived bad actors is what I should say.
yeah,
Because yeah, I mean, I I think it's complicated when it comes to the whole AGP thing, but I mean, not to be so pessimistic, but I don't ever really see it going mainstream. To be quite frank, I mean, the closest
yeah,
is like what I mean. I guess Taff and I are sort of doing a little bit on Dollcast, which is just like sprinkling it in because at the end of the day, like I'm not exactly, I wouldn't call myself an AGP advocate or anything like that. I would say it's important for the people that are struggling with it and for clinicians and therapists to be aware and acknowledge and understand this. But I'm afraid when it gets to the point of the public perception, people can only handle so much information and associations to this concept. And the way it's framed is it's a sexual driver for transition. And when you see some less palatable presentations of that,
Yeah.
That's enough to get it fixed in your mind of what it is.
Right. Yeah. No, it has a serious optics problem for sure. And as much as I do recognize that, like, I still always keep coming back to like, but it's true. You know, that like, regardless of how it looks, like, it is true that it's most of gender dysphoria in males comes from this. And so it's important to talk about. But yeah, I don't know where the ideal endpoint is in terms of like public knowledge. Um, I personally think it'd be good for it to be taught at a very like for it to be included in sex ed in a very simplified way. Just because kids that are getting sex ed, they're at a pubertal age where those feelings are going to start coming up, and it seems a lot safer for me for them to when they have feelings of wanting to be the other sex or like why am I always a girl in my imagination, like that sort of thing, for them to think, oh, it's because I have an atypical sexuality rather than, oh, I actually have a girl soul and I need to transition or I'm never going to be happy. It just, yeah,
No,
seems more
I hear
open-ended to
you.
me.
It's it's because yeah, I mean, I agree with the sense that is factual. It is more factual that way to present it that way and um to frame it that way. And it's just the issue though is that is just the palatability of it, I think is part one. But
Yeah,
number two is that it literally could serve as a justification for considering transition. And so if a kid says, "Oh, I want to transition because I have autosexuality," that's, I don't, I mean, it might be that, and I say kid, I mean, I'm really talking like a 14, 15, 16-year-old
right, an
um,
adolescent.
in adolescence, right? Yeah. Because anyone
Yeah,
prior to that, it's like you can't know um, very well. I mean, there is the HSTS documented uh typology too, but that one I don't even know what distinguishes a regular gay male from someone who's going to transition. um I don't know. Do you know that, Phil? The
uh
distinguishing element.
I don't know for sure. Like, I honestly don't understand that type super well. I
Hmm.
understand the AGP type really well, but there's just so many cases where people put together cases of like, oh, this person's an HSTS, and then I look into them further, and it's like, no, this is an autogynephile LARPing as an HSTS. And but however, I there are some cases that do seem genuine. It just seems so much rarer um
Hmm.
than people expect. You know, they hear the typology and the two types, and I think they kind of implicitly think there'll be somewhat similar numbers of both types when it's really like, I bet it's at minimum 90% AGPs.
Yeah, that's a crazy statistics to throw at them.
Right. It's like numerically, like just by adding up the non homosexuals, I could be confident it's at least 80%. But then when I look at all the trans women that I see in various online forums expressing attraction to men, virtually
Mhm.
all of them seem like AGPs as well. And I just assume the HSTS aren't posting online about gender because they're not going to be interested in it in the same way.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, I don't think so either, and that's one of the tells sort of as to whether someone is, which typology.
Right.
But I think it's just that. I mean, I think the common perception is when they hear a sexual origin, they think of sexuality being presented or being displayed or being that's where like when somebody says, "Oh, they're AGP," they're like, "Well, how do you know?" And it's like, well, the real truth is that the only I always say it takes one to know one. And because like I have this disposition, I'm lucky genetically, I'm able to pass and move in the world as a woman. Transition was absolutely the right decision for me, but it was not something I embraced. It was something I progressively moved into. Um, that like I like to think I'm in the same position, similar to you, Phil, who's really studied this and can kind of see that for what it is and recognize that just because someone's AGP or autosexual doesn't mean that you can't have a lot of those cues or like femininity that you might expect in just an HSTS cohort. Um, in other words, like AGPs can pass and live as women. And like you said earlier, the LARPing thing, yeah. There's a lot of reasons for that, though. I mean, there's a lot of incentives, and yeah, and to be fair too, like I do think that if the motivation for your transition is a sexual fulfillment, that's a bad motivator.
And by that you mean just in isolation, that like the only desire or even main desire is overtly sexual.
Correct. Yeah, like that's your goal. Like I'm going to transition so I can be happy sexually.
Right.
That's a bad goal. It's a bad idea. And it's like, and so, and I do get the sense that there are some, I guess, individuals of the AGP etiology or typology that is their angle, especially when you start getting into like the non-binary sphere, where it's like select surgeries that are happening here, and like there isn't a true effort towards like integration or assimilation, which I that's something I very much share, like as part of the Dollcast team, that as trans people, regardless of what your etiology is, you should be transitioning to not declare a jihad on gender or like try to uproot society. It should just be to handle dysphoria and move through the world sincerely.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very reasonable thing to say, which is that's what I like. Part of what I like about you is you're very reasonable, and it's clear that you've thought through all this stuff to a great degree.
Thanks, Phil. Well, to be fair, I mean, I have had my finger on the pulse for a little while. I mean, I read Men Trapped in Men's Bodies years ago, but I found your book the most relatable.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm glad to hear that. I was gonna ask, like, after reading Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, how did you feel afterwards?
Yeah, like I was grateful for Anne Lawrence illuminating aspects around the decision of transition. I did feel like the accounts within it are, I don't know, just like extremely sexual. Like just very much like that is, I mean, because that's sort of the cornerstone of it, and that's what is bringing these testimonies forward. And I just wish there was more of the emotional elements at play, because I think like I could describe my motivation to transition without almost ever touching the subject. That's like how that's
right, because of the feelings.
Right, because of the emotions. Yeah. And yeah, and so oh gosh, I had something additional to say to that, but essentially, like I think it is because I've I don't know. I believe that sexuality is one of the most powerful influencers on human behavior and strategies that humans do to like work around that. I mean, evolution has literally shaped that. That's how you survive, is via sexuality.
Right.
That it makes too much sense. So back when I was like 13, 14, I came across other explanations. That were like, oh, if you feel like you should have been born a girl, then you're, you might be trans, etc. But they never touch on, they just don't go as deep as.
They don't say why.
They don't say why. No, it's like circular reasoning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it makes too much sense to me that there would be some element of sexuality that needs to be there, because that's what provides the endogenous, consistent aspect of why transition would work for someone or be rational for someone. Otherwise, it's like if it's based on feelings or environmental influences, as soon as you pull those away or change them, you would expect there would be like issues with that person and the decisions they've made. Or there could be. I mean, they could just be resolute in the decision, like, no, this was right for me. Dig their heels in the sand because they don't want to be misperceived. But I think that the reason it has worked for me is because I recognize this endogenous experience that doesn't change regardless of whether I transition or not. It's there. And I think you've talked about that too, where it's like an anchor it's a better anchor as a
Like a
adjective or
stable, like, for
descriptor.
identity. It's like a more
Mhm.
stable anchor, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because it doesn't really change.
Yeah, and I try to point that out because it is very destabilizing to be like, to know you're male, but then, like, have this great yearning to be female and not know why, and then you encounter the gender identity ideology, and it's like, "Okay, maybe I'm, like, gender fluid or gender queer or gender whatever," and it's really confusing, um, and the identity tends to shift toward over time towards being female, and so it seems really simple to just identify with the orientation because that'll always be there.
Mhm. Right, and that's where I find that useful, because I think that's the key descriptor for why transition is not transing the gay away. So this is something I always think about when I hear that phrase um because a lot of I guess, autosexuals will describe their past in female stereotypes of some kind. And it's like, well, what separates that person from a regular homosexual attracted person? And it's like, you got to have some other element at play, or else you could be perceiving it as transing the gay away, like because of your own discomfort with your own femininity if you're a male, or masculinity if you're a female, and you seek transition to escape that, then it really begins to look like transing the gay away. But if you're autosexual, and no, your actual target here is to be the opposite sex as close as you can. Of course, you can't change sex. And I think part of therapy is to sort of reinforce that reality. But to understand that we live in this modern era and we have awesome options medically to help in for people that have these dispositions, it's like it makes sense to me that transition becomes a very viable and rational option when there's actually a mental model constructed internally that goes with the opposite sex.
Right. Like you build up this internal like cross-gender personality or self, and it gets to be built so strongly and solidly that um it's stable enough for when they transition into it that they can actually hold it as a stable sense of self.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's
it's
like
true.
without the orientation, it's like how would someone end up in that situation of having basically gender identity disorder? It doesn't make much sense.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, they could be running away from the stereotype type of thing, you know. Um, but then it looks like transing the gay away. And then it's like, oh, um, I don't know. I have a soft spot for that because I just think that I think that that is something that is really it's becoming a problem, I think, in some ways. It's almost
That
regressive.
meme that meme of transing the gay away,
Mhm. Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't map onto reality, which is my main issue with it.
Oh,
Just
yeah,
because
that's fair.
most of the transitioners are not of homosexual etiology, and it's annoying to have so many people just fundamentally they're getting the situation wrong. Like, there's not that many different types of trans, and they can't even tell which one they're talking about.
Mm.
You know, it's like at most there's like 3, right? If you count ROGD. Like,
Oh, yeah, or just like environmentally induced dysphoria, some kind of
right.
exogenous element. Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of like the endogenous ones, there's 2 of them. And
Mhm.
maybe there's this third exogenous one, but it's like to see people repeating the catchphrase, they're transing the gay away, and almost always that's not actually happening. The homosexuals have they've become a smaller proportion of the transitioners over time as homosexuality has become more societally accepted, which is exactly what you'd expect, you
Mhm.
know, because there's no the motivation to trans the gay away just isn't really there like it used to be. Like there's less to gain from it, you know?
Yeah, I think so. Um, I don't know. It's hard to say because I feel like that was the case. That there was less to gain, but I'm not so sure. as like, as I don't know if we're in like this arc or not, in terms of society regressing a little bit. It's tough to say. I don't know. But I will say is that when it does come to the etiology, one of the things that did confuse me when it comes to the autosexual type, it's what is rationalized with the metasexuality element. But I would have classified myself as bisexual through and through. And I mean, I still do. And because I have attraction to women, that puts me in the autosexual group. And but I mean, I had crushes on guys that I went to school with. And I have been attracted to men as well as women. And I have hooked up with men, not in a cross-gender role, before I ever transitioned. Part of it was just me trying to sort out and make sense of myself. And I met a lot of these guys later on online in dating apps when I was in college. But also, well, I guess in the early parts of college, I started going to gay bars, and I did go dressed up. And I would make friends with the gay guys, and they would literally think I'm like just like them. But I did notice that there were some behavioral differences where like they would be just extremely feminine, like some of them would, not all of them. And I would sort of be like feminine, but not totally, not like the same. There was just an energy difference.
Not theatrically feminine.
Yeah. I think that's a good. Yeah, not theatrically.
Right, like the gay men sometimes they do it a little extra, right? Like when they're conversing and such.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. And so yeah, but what I think threw me off is that I enjoyed those experiences. And even though like sometimes, so like off would come the clothes, and then I had this one night where there were two gay guys fighting over which bed I would sleep in. And like I didn't know what to make of it. Like for me as a little Christian autosexual boy, I had no idea what to really make of these experiences, but I was just learning and taking it in, because the number one thing I wanted was just to make sense of who I was and figure out like who I am. Because like, even though I had seen the typology, it is not a prescriptor for transition. It is just simply means that you are at least that much closer to transition. And so I was still sort of in denial of this. And I was like, am I just gay? But I like women too. So, and it's more socially convenient to bring a woman into the public of my life. So there was that always happening. But at the same time, I felt like I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to go out and experience guys. And I'll never forget the first time I did experience a guy and I was dressed up. It was a much more intense experience and much better. And that sort of illuminated that I think this is telling me something about myself. And the only difference between that experience and some of the other guys I had hooked up with is that I was cross-dressed during it. And I realized, I think this is telling me more about my own sexuality than it is about like really hooking up with this guy.
Did you know about pseudo bisexuality at that point?
I did. Yeah, I did. But the part of that I don't like about it is that it seems to posit that there's not like a genuine androphilic attraction.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's why I tend to shy away from the term pseudo rather than, I think meta attraction is better, just because meta refers to the self.
Right. Yeah.
In a way that doesn't like imply that it's not a real kind of attraction.
Yeah, I like that too, because in the writings it was pseudo.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah, and it's in the technical writings, it's probably still going to be that way for a while, even though the sexologists they've absorbed the term meta attraction from online, but it's not like they're using it in papers.
Yeah. And I'm sure they have good reasons for that. I mean, maybe in the larger number, or maybe in most experiences they've come into, it's better described as pseudo. I know for me, it was much more like meta in that sense that I was already enjoying it to some extent without the clothes, but the clothing and the whole experience of being a woman in this dynamic with the men amplified it. It like took it further. And it was eye-opening to me in
Right.
the
It's just
sense
like
that
way better.
it was just like way, way better. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. But I was still in the social confines of my heterosexual persona life. So in college, even though I was having all these experiences, it was really under the guise of a double life. I was the bro when it came to doing things in college and hanging out with my friends and partying in the fraternity and all these things. Like I was just very, very bro-y. But I didn't necessarily mesh with all of the bro energy necessarily. I was like, there would be things that would happen and would kind of put me off. But I was like, I need to lean into the script because, God forbid, I become a tranny. And
Right.
yeah, right. Like that's a common thing for the AGP, autosexual typology, to do all the masculine things you can do before you give up, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Always double down on masculinity. Give it another
Mhm.
go.
It's the
Yeah.
whole meme of the denial beard or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, so going from there, it was like, um, I was leaning into that. But as soon as I graduated college and those social structures were taken out, and I was sort of it was like a big reset. And I was like, I'm starting my first job. I'm by myself. I have a couple of friends around, but not very many. Really opened up space for me to think more about what's going on with my life and continue to dabble in those different experiences of, hooking up with guys and being with girls. Um and so I meet my partner, Tiffany, and I'm really serious about her and she's serious about me and we love each other. And I am really getting dysphoric by now. So by this point, I'm like, all right, like I'm really hating my male aspects. Anything that I see as a barrier to that self-image, I'm like, I can just make it that much easier to be present in the moment sexually. And like whatever I'm doing, and it goes beyond that even. It just goes to being present at all. And it's like
Just
by
like in
just
everyday life.
yes, exactly. Present in everyday life. Um most tangible was the bedroom, but in reality, it became all of just life. Um, like you said. And realizing that, um, I was like, I need to tell Tiffany, my partner, about my cross-gender persona. Because at this point, I had a whole collection of cross-gender things that I would need to go out, to the club and be fully, you know, drag as a woman, whatever. Um, and so I did, and I just kind of told her like I have girl clothes, and I told her this like 4 or 5 months into our relationship, and she reacted extremely positively, or not extremely positive, but very neutral. Just I envisioned a red flag going off in her mind and going, oh no, I need to run for the hills, but she didn't do that. And she is very heterosexual. She's not, she's no history of hooking up with girls or anything like that. But she just kind of like shrugged it off and was like, okay, no big deal. I'd like to see him sometime. No big deal. And I was like, okay, that's great. Wonderful. And proceed a couple months forward. And at 11 months of our relationship, or no, I'm sorry, at 10 months of our relationship, I professed to her on the way home from a Bible study, because I was really leaning into religion during this kind of period of trying to figure out what I want to do. And I should also stress that I was doing a lot of research on trans widow narratives and detransitioner narratives, to help make sense of patterns or anything I could see reflected in myself in these narratives, and make sure that I'm not making mistakes.
Right. So you wanted to be honest with her after seeing what happened with the dishonesty in the trans widow narratives.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so that's what happened. So I told her I think I'm gender fluid. I didn't say trans because I wanted to give myself space to evaluate if I could be happy with my presentation without doing any medical intervention. Sort of the old school approach, to to transition, and not the modern one where it's like you start HRT and then you come out. I was old school through and through, because I really didn't see medical transition as an end all be all for me. I saw it as a potential pathway I could go down to live a better life, or possibly make my life harder. And I want to really evaluate this. And so I told her I was gender fluid, and I had built it up so much in the car conversation that she thought I was going to tell her I had cancer. I, of course, didn't.
Yeah.
But I was kind of glad that I had set the stage so dismally that she was positive. Again, more positive reaction than I had expected. Although there were some questions that came after when we got home. But essentially, this meant I told her I'd already told my roommates that I was living with, and that I needed to tell my parents. That was the really big hurdle for me emotionally, because I'm a people pleaser, and not like in the sense that like I'm going to do whatever somebody asks, but like I want my parents to, be proud of me, and like, be happy with the child that they raised, and in general, just be likable to other people. I mean, that's something I've always had that trait. And so with her help and my roommate's help, we all came together, and I made this really big PowerPoint. You would actually be probably fairly proud of it, because their autogynephilia was actually in the PowerPoint.
I mean, I was kind of proud when you mentioned that you made a PowerPoint to discuss your feelings.
Oh, I just knew it was going to be a mess. I was going to be like an emotional mess when I tell them, because this was so meaningful to me and so bottled up in me. And I think it is for a lot of people. But especially because I'd had so many experiences that I had never told them about, that it was sort of like a waterfall to tell them anything. And very, very difficult, knowing that they would only view this in a negative light. And so I told them on Easter night of 2018, and I'll never forget it. I sat down on the couch in the living room, and I told them that I think I might be trans. And this time I updated the language, and I said trans, because I wanted them to have the worst expectation of what their child might do, versus where I was with Tiffany, and it was a little bit more fluid. And that was also 2 months prior. And I had already like moved forward a little bit more in my planning, that I wanted to just prepare it for the worst, rip the Band-Aid off, and just say, look, this actually might be me. And I know you all probably don't see this coming, but this is what I think. And they reacted negatively, but it was whatever. It was what I expected. But the relief from just telling them this aspect of myself that was so hidden and so relevant to who I am, to just tell them that, it was like a waterfall of pent-up emotions. And I mean, I always say this, but I slept the best I've ever slept in my life that night, just because the pressure was off of me, and I had finally told them, and I felt free to move forward in my life, regardless of whether they would cut me off or not. And I just prayed that they wouldn't.
How did Tiffany first react to seeing you cross-dressed, like the first time she saw that?
Oh, good question. Gosh, it's kind of bad to be like, I don't remember the first time. But I can say this. I didn't really lean into, one of the things I'll say is like, I don't think the typology is necessarily particularly helpful for explaining to regular people why I'm like dysphoric, or like gender dysphoric, or want to transition to live as a woman. So at the time I took those tactics that I learned, and I said, and I told my roommates and her that I had this deep discomfort with my male aspects of my body, and that I had a cross-gender identity that they didn't know about, but I had hooked up with lots of guys, and kind of saw myself as a woman in my mind. And I try to explain it in that type of language, because I find that framing just actually somehow is easier and better than just using the words.
Right.
Sometimes.
Actually describing it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so that kind of helped them like realize something. And I said, look, I need to get over my fear of all these repressed emotions. We should do a fashion show. And so I don't know if this was the first time Tiffany saw me cross-dressed or not, but Tiffany and I just wore a bunch of dresses and like pretended to do like a fashion show face-off, and my roommates were the judges. And she won, of course, like as she should. But it helped me get over my fear of just being seen publicly in as feminine, as like being feminine, and like by people I actually know, even though by this point I had already been like dressing up completely to the nines as a woman just for strangers, to help bridge that gap. But I think there's a big element of like repressed femininity almost that a lot of autosexual people have to work past.
Yeah, there's like mental blocks because if you have so many years of trying to suppress it, it's hard to give up that habit of suppressing it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know, she responded positively. I mean, she didn't she wasn't disgusted or turned off by it. She wasn't turned on by it, but she was just she saw
And
it as a
neutral's
mode of
good.
expression. Yeah, yeah. No, it definitely is. Um, but she was able to see it as a mode of expression for me. And I think it just has to do with the fact that I do have a very wide disposition of behavior, in the sense that like I I could do the LARPing of HSTS fairly well and people not easily know, except like informed individuals
Right.
like yourself.
Right. I'd still have my like I'd be like,
Right,
Yeah.
but you're not the average person.
No. Yeah.
And in fact, I'm convinced that many do consider me in that framework. So it's like, even when I did the interview with boys, a lot of the comments, a healthy amount, were repressed homosexuality.
Yeah.
And this is the issues that the autosexual framing has, or like this typology. It's I still think there's a lot of value in the structures and ultimately in what it's getting at. But the framing and the rigidity, when compared to the diversity of the expression in this category, it's difficult to I don't know, it just presents some real challenges for its adoption.
Well, yeah, I know.
I don't know. What do you think?
I've heard that sort of feedback a lot, that the concept of autogynephilia is a little, it's too narrow and it doesn't capture the broad range of the experience. But I guess my way of thinking about it is all this theory is saying is that whatever your usual orientation would be is it's pointed inward. So I think we
Mhm.
should expect that just as heterosexuality has a wide range of expressions, that so too will auto heterosexuality. And so, yeah, a lot of people do sort of, they have a narrow conception of what autogynephilia can entail, but it's it's something like, there's one paper that Blanchard had where he closed it out saying something like, in the end, we can't truly know how a man comes to love himself as a woman until we understand how men love women. Something like that, where it's
Profound.
right. Yeah, no, he's an absolute baller of a writer. His writing is so good. Like, there, I read so many papers as part of writing my book, and it's clear that he put tremendous effort into making his sentences so clear and unambiguous and crisp, and sometimes even poetic when he could like sneak it in there. And
Yeah.
it's, yeah, I'm just like continually impressed with just how solid of a foundation he built with in his 15 years of working on that subject in the gender clinic. Just, it's really impressive what he accomplished in that time to finally put transgenderism, at least the male to female form of it, on a solid theoretical basis, whereas that had not been achieved before. And I'm hoping that my campaigning to have autoandrophilia recognized will sort of further strengthen the theory in the sense that it overall applies to both sexes, and it'll sort of get out of this weird spot where detractors say like the theory's weak because it doesn't explain trans men. And
Mm,
it's like, how can you have this
interesting.
theory that just explains one sex but not the other? It's clearly incomplete and wrong. Whereas I think it's much stronger if the theory describes both sexes in an analogous manner. And yeah, while there's an incentive, while I do like that about it, that I think it's a more solid theory, I also just say it because I think it's actually true that the sort of the homosexual and autosexual types occur in both sexes. And I, we still don't have good quantitative data to sort of back up the female to male picture as well as, Blanchard did for the male to female.
Hmm.
But I'm pretty confident that, at the absolute worst, in terms of like for my hypothesis, like that 30% of trans men are of autoandrophilic etiology, I would think that's like the absolute most conservative position. Whereas I realistically, I think it's most of them, and it just sexologists they have this axiomatic belief that females don't get paraphilias, and that therefore, since autogynephilia is a paraphilia, that means autoandrophilia is too, and therefore females will not have it. Um, and it's just
Oh,
like,
lovely. Yes.
right. I know I've been frustrated dealing with this line of thought because I mean I just got done sort of editing really a paper where I'm arguing for female autoandrophilia. And
Mm,
it's just frustrating to me because there's dozens of pre-existing studies that have measured arousal from cross-gender fantasies or from cross-dressing in both sexes. And just consistently the finding is that there's some people in both sexes that basically say, yeah, I have this experience. And I feel like only the male responses are being taken seriously as indicative of something, whereas like the female responses, it's just like, oh, who knows why they're doing that? Could be a social
mhm.
contagion or personality disorder. Who knows? And
Yeah.
it's just like, what if it's just the most obvious thing that they're also attracted to being the other sex?
Mhm. No, yeah, I mean, this is where your narratives are super valuable and very interesting on your YouTube channel. Because I mean, well, even before that, even in your book, I found it like extremely eye-opening as to um some of the testimonies that the women or natal females transitioning to male would talk about. And the parallels to autosexuality or like AGP that were there, but they're a little different because it's females.
Yeah, they're a little
Um,
more femme-brained in general, but it's like
yeah,
kind
that's
of
a
the
good way
same
to put
thing.
it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. And so, yeah, I found that extremely eye opening. And it's really where I think that the basis of autosexuality has really good evidence that there's an in target inversion error, and that can be take a hetero form or a homo form, depending on like your outward disposition. But to say that I'm not sure whether I have mixed feelings about like the orientation aspect of the word, but no matter what, I do think it's a sexuality. Um, no matter what, like that seems like that's not very controversial to say. Although maybe that is. Um, but that it's at least at some degree a sexuality that points inward, and that this is a experience that spans across groups, and seems to be a big driver for transition when it's hetero. Well, when it's auto heterosexuality.
Yeah. It's time will tell if I'm right about the female to male situation.
Yeah, gotta
As you
follow the
saw,
data. Yeah.
yeah, as you saw in the my appearance on Gender a Wider Lens that came out a couple days ago, Stella really doesn't like the autoandrophilia hypothesis.
Mm,
Um, Sasha doesn't either, but they're really heavily doubting it, and it seems strange to me because it's like if they really had listened to the natal females that have detransitioned and everything describe their experience, wouldn't they have come across forms of thinking that resemble autoandrophilia? It's like,
Well, there's that whole issue of for females in particular of the cohort that wants to escape the sexualization of their natal sex.
right,
That complicates things to say the least.
right. And also, it technically, if patriarchy is as oppressive as some feminists say it is, then it's also technically an upgrade to transition to male. At least, like, it's an
Mhm.
individualistic way of escaping patriarchy, even if you can't systemically do it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Um yeah, something that I come back to though in regards to what you said earlier about the, I guess, teaching of AGP, and I know I offered those 2 points. I do find it interesting that I can't remember where this was, but that if a person is aware that that's a motivation for them, that they're less likely to transition.
Yeah, I do. I think Michael Bailey has collected some data. I think
Mm.
that'll show that. Um, it's not yet published, but I just intuitively it makes sense to me that um, in a social environment where the only other message people are getting is that the gender identity sort of having a woman's soul sort of explanation. In that environment, if you introduce the autogynephilia theory and people recognize themselves in it, I think, of course, it's going to organically lead to less people choosing the transition.
Mhm.
And
Right.
my hope is that the ones that choose that they are making the right decision and they're not just, you know, avoiding the decision that would be right for them just because they're feeling some momentary shame or whatever. Um, but I I do think transition is people are doing it too flippantly these days. Like it's not treated with the seriousness I think that I'd like to see it treated with. Like how when you described your own experience, you thought about it a great deal and you didn't have it as the first option.
No.
And
Yeah, in fact,
yeah,
I honestly couldn't even make sense of it all holistically because even though I knew about the typology, I thought it seemed, and maybe I had a bad understanding of it, but it seemed very much focused on the sexuality when I felt like I was feeling genuine incongruence with my gender. Like I just felt like I hated my masculine aspects and that like dysphoria is somehow separate from like autosexuality or whatever, only to come like realize, which I mean I did realize like in my early 20s, like no, that's not a true like separation, but that's how I originally responded to it when I
yeah,
learned about it.
that's normal.
um and yeah, it's a very normal response. It seems that's what I've found that in other narratives too. um Only to come full circle to realize no, this is something that sticks with you and it matures slash like it doesn't go away. Um and I think there's different strategies to cope with it. um but I do think that like it does make sense for autosexual people, and so I use autosexual to describe it for me because I am
Yeah,
transitioned. So like for me in my current form, it is literally just attraction back to myself. I don't change anything, I'm just who I am now.
right.
But before, it would be autoheterosexuality. But that's where I think the meat and potatoes of all of this is the inverted sexual.
It's the auto part.
It's the auto part. Exactly. That's the utility of the theory, in my view. And if I'm going to explain it to people, I will only use that. I will say, like, oh, yeah, well, sometimes I'll open up about my autosexuality and how that influenced my transition and like the reasons that that gave me dysphoria. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. And I won't go into all the other stuff unless somebody, wants to go there
How
in
do
their
people
full
respond to
form.
that?
Um, a lot of times I don't get a lot of bites. Like they don't really say anything to
Oh,
it. They
there's like,
don't.
alright.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. I mean, if they do ask, I'll just explain it in terms of like, oh, I can be attracted to myself. And before transition, I was attracted to myself as female. This was how I would, this was something I had to do to interact with other people in a sensual manner. And I mean, no one has really pressed me that much about it, but that's sort of how I would open up into it. Most of the time, I can just say, "Oh, gender dysphoria," like, and leave it sort of at that level, and it's sufficient. I mean, people are very like tend to be pretty polite about the
They don't
subject.
wanna ask more questions about that. They're like, "Oh, that's so personal. I don't wanna ask about
Exactly.
that." Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Um, yeah. As much as I wish autosexuality was like fully understood, um, I'm afraid in the short term it's going to be absolutely. I don't know if I want to say demonized, but I I monitor gender critical probably a little too much for my own mental health, but I'm always so
Yeah.
interested on what they're doing.
I
Um,
monitor as well, and it's not looking pretty.
and it's not looking good. Okay, yeah. So
No.
you are
Yeah.
very well aware. Yeah.
No, it's gonna be ugly. Like, that's
Mhm.
like, it's gonna be ugly for at least a few years. Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
and, you know, I it's not like I want us to be a contributor to subjecting the AGPs and AAPs to the backlash, but I feel like the problem that happened was that a gender religion was imposed top down on society. That and this gender religion was created by the autosexuals, even though they didn't realize what was driving their feelings. And I think that a lot of people resent the gender religion that got imposed on them. And I think there is gonna be some backlash for sure. But I always just keep coming back to like, but it's true. Because like as much as like political narratives are important for achieving particular goals, like we also you want your ideas to match up to reality so that
Mhm.
you when you make predictions they can come true. And
Precisely. Yeah. That's why I'm here
yeah,
doing this interview with you. It's
yeah,
because
no,
it
and
is
I
true.
I appreciate it. Yeah, no, it's it's true. And like when I it took me a while to first realize it. Um, when I first read about typology, I got obsessed with reading about the gender stuff. And it wasn't until 5 or 6 weeks in that I finally read Anne Lawrence's book. And then once I was done with that, I felt like this mixture of like dread and recognition.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, because I
Yeah.
mean, reading her book because it's about transsexualism, I was worried that I was gonna inevitably become transsexual, even though I don't have the right physical traits for it. And
Oh, that's interesting. Like you
yeah,
didn't want to transition, but you thought it was a
no, no, like in even years before I even had heard about autogynephilia, like the first night that I like got really confused with where my gender issues came to the forefront, my initial reaction was like, "No, I can't be trans. I'm 6'4". No, like I can't." Like it was immediately like
Yeah.
is the immediate concern before I understood anything about transsexualism was like I I have no chance in hell of ever passing. Like this can't,
Mm.
no, I don't want this to be me.
Oh.
And um so it was kind of a relief to learn about like autogynephilia at first. Learning about it didn't feel that good, like I said, mixture of dread and recognition. um but I got over it. A couple months later I was fine. I've talked about it with tons of people throughout the course of like researching and writing my book, and that eliminated sort of whatever residual shame there was, because when you talk to people
Mhm.
about it and then
Yeah.
they don't seem offended or like doesn't bother them at all, the implicit message you get is that it's not bad.
Yeah. No, it's true. And I think that's something that really distinguishes it from some other I guess sexualities that are less conducive socially. Um,
Like
and
the
that's where,
unethical ones.
yeah, the unethical ones. Yeah. Just
Yeah.
not trying to like, I'm not in the business of shaming any sexualities at all, because I'm obviously, I'm saying that it's the truth is muddy. But the thing about autosexuality is the gender critical crowd really wants to paint it as a as like part of it is getting off on boundary violations. Um,
Yeah.
and I just,
Yeah.
that to me is so wild, because I don't see that. I mean, I see it as the mostly trans women that don't want to believe they're through and through women, because that's the gender ideology religion, that they're the same, just want to be seen and validated in that respect, and therefore want to use women's spaces or whatever. And it has very little to do with any arousal at the idea of invading a women's space.
Right. No, most AGPs would be horrified by that.
Yes.
That they're being seen as like sexually deviant men rather than women. That's horrifying to them. It's
Absolutely.
honestly it's the root of their opposition to the autogonophilia theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah, but this
y-
doesn't, they're not going to
yeah,
illuminate this. This is too
right.
convenient
Yeah.
for,
No, the
yeah,
gender criticals, they too often they just basically they think of autogonophilia in terms of behaviors
right.
rather than as a sexuality. And
Exactly. Yeah.
rather than like as a motivational drive or like something that causes various thoughts and feelings. They just see particular behaviors that they find distasteful, and to them that's what autogonophilia is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense because it's like just in the sense that um you know like heterosexual men famously like commit sexual assaults, right? But it doesn't mean that that's what heterosexuality is, innately. Like there's proper ways of acting on it and improper ways, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's really important to separate the behaviors from the motivational drive underlying it.
Completely. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think what doesn't help is that there are people there. All it takes is like one example, and then they blow that out of proportion, and that's what they use. So like if someone's like in a women's restroom, um, I don't know, doing something inappropriate, and they record themselves, which has happened,
Right.
they'll take
Yeah.
that and use it as like, oh, this is all of them. When in reality, I think a good portion, I think most would, like you said, dread that ever being associated to
That'd
them.
be a nightmare for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. I mean, what's more invalidating for your womanhood than doing something that male predators do? Like
Right. Or at least
that whole
having a
thing.
bunch of women like call you a predator,
Oh
you
yeah.
know.
Oh gosh, yeah. Um no, for sure. And I mean, it's just yeah, it's tricky though. I do think, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this too, is this equivocation of narcissism and autosexuality. I found this to be a scary theme when I was reading about trans widow narratives. Um, like Shannon Thrace's book, for example, was one of the books I read. And I actually went up to her at the Genspect conference and thanked her for writing that book, because I felt like it gave me a lot of signals of what to steer clear of, what to avoid. But at the end of the day, I reflected on my personality more broadly, like historically, and I thought, I actually really don't have traits of narcissism, but I would have those if you interpret all my self inwardness as narcissism. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, like I was saying earlier, where I would like pretend for hours by myself. Um, and to the point where I would even deny wanting to play with my siblings. They would like ask me, like my brother had this little phrase of like, Skyler, um, like, I want to play with you. And then I would respond like, haha, no, nothing with you. And like, it was so mean, like so mean, like I look back and I'm just like, oh, that's so cringeworthy. But what does that open up about my psyche? And this is where I really was concerned and was just craving more knowledge and more knowledge. And I'm like, thank God I'm looking to transition in the late 20 teens versus in like just a decade earlier, there was like half as many resources, and now there's all these resources. And one in particular that really helped me, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here a little bit, is because I had a very Christian influenced background, was a researcher, Mark Yarhouse, and his book, Understanding Gender Dysphoria, which sort of framed the issue of gender dysphoria from the Bible in 3 different lenses. And even though it doesn't give you like what the lens should be, or like it doesn't, that's what I actually love about the book, is that it doesn't prescribe anything specifically. It leaves it up to these different viewpoints and ways you can look at the phenomenon, all the way from the first viewpoint, which is integrity, which is like the most essentialist, you're created how you're created, you should never do anything, viewpoint, to disability, to diversity. And you can kind of see in those different like spheres how someone might make sense of wanting to transition. And I was like, oh, I fit right in that disability lens. Like, this is like a disability to me. You know, this gender dysphoria, it's really messing up my cognitive thinking. It's disrupting me. It's robbing me of joy. And it's making life just, it's making me dread my life. It's like, and it's all under the presupposition that I don't transition. And then it's like, at least transition brings me to the light in my life if I can make those decisions, but if I don't need to. But going back to the narcissism thing, this is where I was a little concerned, that if I go to embrace transition, might some of that narcissism come forward? And what would that look like? And this is where I was really leaning into those trans widow narratives to sort of give me some flags, like drawing inward to yourself, not being, I guess, turning down social events, not doing things with other people. I mean, these were just some of the things that I was sort of like, I need to be aware of these things or cognizant. But I guess it's not really, from what I can tell, it actually doesn't really seem like narcissism is the same thing here at all.
Yeah, I mean, I still haven't done a lot of deep reading on narcissism to have a really solid stance on what it is and what it is not. And which is probably a weakness when I have gender critical people interviewing me and they compare it to narcissism, and my response is basically like, it's not. It's a form of sexuality, but I also not the best yet at articulating why it's not narcissism.
But might it predispose someone to
narcissism?
narcissism?
I think it can have narcissistic consequences that like that it would sort of like, it could exaggerate someone's like innate level of narcissism, that like say they're a little bit narcissistic, but then they get like really attached to that cross-gender persona, and then that can sort of like synergistically make them more narcissistic. But like, even if that is
to lie,
right, yeah, and even if that is the case, it's still, I think it's important to disentangle like the orientation itself from its potential consequences, because it can play out a whole bunch of different ways, and it just fundamentally, to me, it's a form of sexuality. It's not like a personality disorder. Like, I guess it can lead to identity disorders, but and people with autogonophilia probably have atypically high rates of cluster B traits, but they're just, I think when people say it's narcissism, they simply focus on the fact that it's like, oh, it's about yourself and it's about self-love. Just looking at the auto and the philia in the word.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the entire depth of their analysis, that it's like, oh, it's straightforwardly, obviously narcissistic for that reason. And
I see. Yeah, like sort of the superficial reading is just,
right,
it is narcissistic. Yeah.
Right. And but like I said, even though like superficially it has resemblance to narcissism, I think it's a different mental process than whatever it is that usually leads to narcissism. Because
yeah,
I've met plenty of AGPs that are not narcissistic, that think about others quite a bit and are like reasonable, decent people. And it's clearly not like fully congruent. Like it is not identical to narcissism. It's like maybe it co-occurs often, but you know what? Like autism co-occurs with AGP quite a lot too. But
Right. Yeah.
but it's also AGP isn't just autism,
Yeah. No, it's definitely not. I mean, although I do feel like the word autism has, or like the construct of what it represents has significantly expanded in the past like decade or so, to not just go from like what I used to think of autism as like real measurable behavioral and social impairments that are like persistent across a person's behavior, to the point where they can't form friendships. Basically, they have
Right.
trouble even talking, to
Right. It
this
was like
new.
separate from
Yeah.
Asperger's.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, now
Right.
Asperger's and autism are like the exact same thing.
Right. They're the same
Um,
thing where it's like, yeah, when I first heard about
yeah.
Asperger's, I was like, oh, that's whatever I have. you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
I'm like, I immediately related to it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it's been this ever
yeah.
expansive definition that's like any kind of structural way of thinking is autism. Like I I think it's a broader reflection of people's desire to categorize things. And I don't know, maybe or maybe not, but like I'll never forget I was like rejoining my parents' church about a year ago. And um and there was actually a trans, I'm pretty sure a trans person, could have just been identified a different way, but I'm pretty sure trans, in terms of the presentation. It was a natal male, but very much almost like goth girl dressed style. And she sat
That's
beside
it.
me. And I was like, oh, I know. And so, like, wow, what are the odds? Like, this is pretty crazy. This never would have happened 10 years ago. But here I am sitting in a church welcome group class thing. Um, it's like get to know the church, and they're sitting right beside me, and they don't know I'm trans, but I can clear as day see it with them. And one of the first things that this person announces to me is, "Oh, I'm so and so. My name is so and so. I'm here this, and I have autism," and just volunteers that information to me. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is an identity in some respects.
It is these days. Yeah. But also someone that just straightforwardly says that, even though
Yeah.
it's not necessarily the right social environment for it, it's like, okay, I kind of believe them.
Yeah.
you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just was curious by what they were really conveying by that. Because,
Right.
like,
Yeah,
what
it's
are you
hard to know.
really? Yeah, yeah. So, well, that's a little tangent on autism. I personally don't. I don't know what to think about the relationship between autism and the ROGD boys or AGP boys. You know, presenting to the clinics. Some seem really convinced it's there, and then I think some of the more classical researchers would disagree.
Yeah.
What do you
Well,
think?
I think it's long been recognized that the late onset male to female transsexuals tend to like using computers and being online
That's true.
and, and having nerdy hobbies. Like this has been a long-standing observation. So even if people might quibble over like whether it's autism or whatever, like this sort of phenotype, this mental phenotype we're seeing, it's real and it's recurring. Um, I think the my guess about the relationship of autism to autosexuality
Hmm.
is that it's autism is sort of causally upstream in the sense that I think there's sort of a broad internalization in ways of thinking that happens with autism where they'll have like a rich inner world and a lot inward focus mentally, often be introverted. And I think that whatever that erotic target location inversion mechanism is, like whatever, it's probably the smallest little anatomic glitch in your brain. It's probably so small. And um whatever that is, it gets flipped inward more often with autists. I think it's my guess is that it's just part of the broader internalization. With autism, sometimes it'll happen to like that sort of location mechanism with regards to sexual orientation. And so I think that's why autism is more prevalent among AGPs and AAPs, just because like it's a downstream effect of the internalization from their autism. And just to be clear, this is a hypothesis. This data has not been gathered. I'm just trying to make sense of this tremendous overlap between trans and autism. And specifically, it seems like the autosexual type of trans and autism. And it seems like my guess is that they are causally related. And, I often point to the fact that both these words, like autosexual and autism, they start with the same Greek root from autos for self. And that both reflect sort of that turn inward towards the self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny you bring up that Greek word structure thing, because whenever I'm confronted with autosexuality, isn't that just like autogynephilia in a a rebranded sense or whatever? I always like to point out the Greek etiology of words as well, how like a regular man is I guess heterosexual is gynophilic. Would that just be the right way? And then, a regular woman would be attracted to men, would be androphilic. And it's just, you're just taking that Greek word and extending it with the auto to indicate that it's energy reflected back on yourself. And I do find that is, that's helpful to like, it's a primer in conversations to help, like, I guess, I don't want to say destigmatize, but help generalize the understanding away from, it being this icky word.
It has a bad mouth feel, autogynephilia.
It does.
Like
it does.
It's not the auto part. It's the gyna. Like a lot of people associate the philia is in particular just because it's people associate it with the most forbidden type of attraction, which we don't need to name. But also gyna, like so many women have negative experiences with like the gynecologist, for example. And
that's interesting.
And I think that also just how it sounds, just like with the hard G and the Y, there's something that's not as like warm and soothing about it. Like there's something more, has like an edge to it, an abrasiveness that like say like andro doesn't. Andro's much softer. So yeah, I think with the autogynephilia word, the second and third roots in it, they have bad mouthfeel or bad associations, but the auto part is fine. And so that's why, it makes sense to talk in terms of like autosexuality or autoheterosexuality.
Right. Yeah. And I've lately been more sensitive to appreciating that extension part of it, the hetero or homosexual extension. I don't know, because like, listening.
I mean, as a post-transitioner, you obviously wouldn't want to be using terms that are anchored to your birth sex, right? Like you're gonna want to like, if there's an option where you don't have to do that, you're gonna pick the broader one, like autosexual, that doesn't say anything about your birth sex.
Well, it just is also general enough to be useful in the sense of what I would really say is the critical piece. I mean, it's like this whole construct of autogynephilia, while it may be true, is not very useful except for to the person that is considering to transition and the clinician that's helping them make those informed decisions. This is like I've come to really believe this.
Or the girlfriend of the wife of a man who's like cross-dressing and they're trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, potentially even there, I would still be like, I don't know. It's like,
but you're right. It's most useful for clinicians and the people who actually experience it.
Correct. Yeah, they're the ones who need to understand the breadth of how this can manifest and what it all ultimately points to is an inversion of sexual attraction onto yourself in either the body you currently have or the body you wish you had, which is the opposite sex. And so that's why autosexual is exactly the layer that I like to give it, because it's like, well, really, that's the piece for me, is like, I can be attracted to myself. I can be, it doesn't mean I predominantly am, but I think I am, but just as a side note, but it doesn't mean that's everyone's attraction level. And like, I have a partner, I'm married, and it's like, I've taken specific actions to try to avoid any of those layers of narcissism, of being more in love with myself than I am with my partner. And it's why, like, I always try to put the energy into like our bond versus my own self bond. And so I'm very critical of like time I might just spend by myself versus with her. Um, it's important to me to not let her feel like there's another woman in the room or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Because that was a big theme in a lot of these discussions, and I think especially with later stage AGP transitioners, that becomes an even stronger element, because I guess the artifacts, the constructs have had more time to mature and more have accumulated more weight, I guess, that they can't really hide it, maybe, or something. I mean,
Right. There's
it's
like a potential energy that's built up that like sort of bursts out, and then
yeah.
it's just so overt, and like such a strong departure from what the wives were previously experiencing with their
Mm-hmm.
partners, where I could see why they feel like there's like this other woman that's stealing their man.
Yes. Yes. And I'm so sympathetic to that, because it's like, I mean, the last thing I want is my life to ever look like that. And so that's why I've taken such steps to I don't know, confront the matter before I ever got married, or could bring the person I love the most into a circumstance like that. Um and it's like, and that's where it's just like, I do believe in this model typology, for not just the elements that it's true, but it does have utility for people that are in this position to recognize that this is something that's a pattern in their life. Again, it's the key element is the autosexual um orientation, in my view, but there's lots of manifestations that could help them map onto their experience, maybe in a less direct route. I've been seeing more of that, I think, with your channel and the navel gaze, and why it can be useful to have some of those more tangible examples of how it presents. And so I've come to see that value as well. But it's very much something where it's just so diverse of a presentational phenomenon that I do wonder, like, what is the power of predictability here for, like, I don't know, like a AGP that ends up like transitioning and marrying a man versus someone who is exclusive to women. It's just
Right. I
it's
mean,
tough.
if I were to guess, the strongest variable would be the proportion of auto to allo,
That's
and then
interesting.
also the presence or absence of meta attraction in terms
Mhm.
of like whether they would want to be with a man. I think the ones who end up anallo erotic, like not attracted to anyone else, I think they have basically the strongest form of it. But also the ones who are only attracted to men and could never imagine being with a woman, I think they have it similarly strong as the anallo erotic ones, but they also have meta attraction. And
Mhm. That's
so I
yeah.
think my guess is that the androphilic and the analloerotic ones are gonna tend to have a greater degree of gender issues and transition more often.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
Does that make
I
sense?
yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, that was another interesting thing to me in the literature, is this notion of that I was very sensitive to, in the sense of like, oh, I think I'm very auto attracted. Like, I'm very wired in that ratio of auto and allo. It's like, for myself personally, I saw myself much more auto than allo, but my desire, ironically, to date and be partnered with other people was more born out of a desire to learn about myself in those dynamics of those relationships. But I also found that, like, well, I actually can love other people too. Like, it's not like I can. It's just that it's easier for me. It's more natural to just be like, sort of wired into myself, which manifested itself in lots of different ways growing up. And but the notion I was trying to get at was that in the literature, I read that it was in competition with
Right.
outward attraction, right? So like auto is in competition with allo.
Right. Yeah. And that is sort of how it's described in a couple of Blanchard's papers. I think it's still not like super determined whether they directly compete. I think
Mm-hmm.
they kind of organically do compete in the sense that the things that suit your external attraction to women are generally things that conflict with the internal attraction to women. Like,
Mm.
for example, in my own case, the fact that I'm tall and muscular helps with attracting women, but also it really sucks for autogonophilia. And so it's like, yeah, the two sides are always going to be in conflict just because of sexual dimorphism, basically.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I don't quite know what to make of that, in the sense that like I feel like it's helped me remove a barrier to having to project that image of myself as female when I am engaging in any bedroom activities, we'll say.
Right. Now
Um,
you're just you,
Now I'm
right?
just me, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it's liberating to say the least. I mean, it's like much less of a cognitive workout now, but also I feel like I've atrophied in that muscle, which is kind of weird to say, but it's like my imagination has dimmed because I'm now transitioned into my target. So it's like I don't have the need to project this anymore. And so it's kind of weird to me almost. It's nice. It feels more natural in a lot of ways. Um, but it is an unexpected result of transition that like I wouldn't be able to, I guess, project the mental image like I used to. Now I just see it.
Right.
Um,
And so you don't need to. And like
yeah, I don't need
that's
to.
yeah, and that's fine. It frees up your brain to actually think of more useful things.
Yeah. And be
Then
present in the moment. It's true.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's a good thing. It's just it was a little bit of an unexpected shift when going through transition.
Yeah. I mean, I've read um similar sorts of things described by transsexuals before where they, after being transitioned for a while, they'll realize like, "Oh my god, I haven't been thinking about gender at all. I've just been living." And it's like nice to have a break from that. And it's not something they anticipated up front.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, I totally relate with that because well, before transition, your idle brain energy is eaten up by this I'd almost call it obsession, but it's really just a series of theoretical um assumptions of what life would be like living as the opposite sex. This was especially true for me in um, high school, of all places, actually, and in college, but especially in high school, um, where I would catch myself daydreaming. And I would be daydreaming of exactly that very type of thing of like, what would life be like at my school as the opposite sex? What sports would I play? Like, who would be my friends? Like, just all sorts of theoretical possibilities. Um, and a lot of them, actually, no, all of them basically were non-sexual because I'm like in school, I'm in class, and I'm like, around people. So it was just a lot of possibilities of what life would look like in these theoretical situations. And 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 what's funny is well, I would literally, if I caught myself, then I would try to stop thinking about those things. But there were a couple times where I'd get called on and my face would just flush red like no other, as if they knew what I was thinking. But no one knew what was going on in my head. But I couldn't like break from that easily. Um
Right.
so yeah. Um anyways, I don't know where I'm going with this now. I'm just talking about my past, but
Uh,
um
That's
mhm.
fine. I mean, I don't usually plan out these interviews too much. I just like hitting record and seeing what happens. Um,
Yeah.
something, um, something back to the, I guess, gender critical discussion in the Genspect conference. Something I thought was interesting was like I heard murmurs from people that there was a passing trans woman there, but like the people that were telling me this didn't know who it was. And and it's and and I think, yeah, when I was hearing about that, I was talking to Nina Paley, and she's like, she mentioned like with the bathroom, she's like, well, if she passes, she passes. Can't do anything about it. Like
Oh, Nina.
just very like practical that like, if someone literally passes, then like, what are you gonna do about it?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's
How many
true.
people did you tell at the conference that you were trans?
Oh, yeah. So the Genspect Denver conference last year, yeah, I took the plunge and went to it. I'm not even sure quite what was going through my mind, except for that I wanted to see firsthand what was going on at, I guess, at Genspect. I had been following the organization for some time online on their socials. And I generally really liked the work they were doing. I was like, this is certainly better than what WPATH is doing, and the all affirming approach to medical care, which I didn't think really served anyone well, and the growing number of detransitioners that they were platforming and how valuable their stories were. So I resolved to go to it. And so I bought a ticket with my own money and all of that stuff, and just went by myself. And I was a little bit terrified to go, not going to lie, because I was like, I'm going to be around a lot of people that probably would look at me with hostility. At least some portion of their audience would, but that's only if they know me. And so I kind of took cover in the fact that I didn't have an online presence. I did, but it was extremely minimal, like super small. I just was like a regular anonymous person almost on Twitter, and then a couple of videos online, but not really anything that would call out that I was trans or anything like that. And so I went to the conference, and I honestly loved it. I thought it was so refreshing. I thought it was
Yeah, I
so
liked it too. Yeah.
eye-opening. Yeah, I thought it was great. And I was like, the energy is palpable, like I can taste it in the room, and people are motivated and excited to really get what I consider better gender medicine. I was kind of appalled to see how uninformed, in my view, the general audience seemed to be about autosexuality.
It's awful. It's awful.
I was like, this is
Yeah.
really surprising, but nonetheless, it is what it is. And you had some shout outs. I think Alex Byrne
Yeah.
gave you a shout out, and I was like, okay,
That was kind of him.
Plug.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. But no, I mean, I went there and I sat at the front, like the front table, and I was diligently taking notes. Like, Julia Malott.
Yeah. Julia
Yeah.
Malata.
Yeah, Julia Malata. Thank you. She was there, and I met her. And she like literally commented, she's like, "You're acting like this is a college lecture. You're taking so many notes." And maybe that was part of like the disguise. I don't know, but I was really taking it in. So I honestly was just super thrilled to be like, I just felt like I wanted to write everything down because it was so interesting. But I was sitting up there in the front, and I realized that a lot of the malice I had in my head may not translate. I mean, I saw it didn't seem like you were being treated poorly at the conference. And I don't know. Julia said that she was getting looks and such, but I didn't see anything like really that demonstrated a lot of animosity. At least not like obviously and opaquely to my face or like close to me. So I was like, well, okay, this seems fine. And this whole time I was using the women's restrooms. Now, like I will say on reflection, I think maybe that was insensitive of me. I don't know. I know there's the whole practicality of passing, and I wanted to know, did I actually pass? And this really cemented that.
Yeah, no. What stronger confirmation do you have for passing than the fact that you passed at a turfy conference?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's true. I mean, I use that as my example that no, some trans women do pass. Um, and you can't know it for everyone. And I'm not even the best there is. I mean, there's absolutely trans women that pass better than me. Like, I am not by any means this pinnacle of achievement or anything. It's just I'm lucky. I'm very lucky to have that ability, I guess, or privilege to just pass throughout the world and not make a big deal of my gender, like that background of myself. And I put it to the stress test at this gender conference. And actually, in the line for the women's bathroom the second day, I struck up a conversation. I'm not going to mention her name, with someone who is natal female, actually associates with the more gender critical crowd. And we just had a nice, polite conversation on the way into the women's restroom. And I used the bathroom, and that was that. No one cared.
Yeah.
No issue. There's no problem at all. And yeah, and that gave me the sense that, like, yeah, I don't think this is really an issue. It's something that's fabricated as an issue, I think. But I think there's also a lot more trans people that aren't fully passing and are using.
Yeah, no, it's most don't pass. Like, for instance, it would be an issue if I tried to go in there. You know, like, I'm very tall, very, very male, and that would obviously not fly. And, I don't use the women's bathroom. It's just not something I do. And so I didn't at the conference either. That would kind of be a crazy place to try it out for the first time.
Oh, no kidding. No kidding. Yeah. For sure. And I think what you said when I saw the backlash on social media about you in the blue dress after the conference really woke me up to, oh my gosh, like, I think you said in a video, like, I'm not sure if this was you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but somewhere along the lines, the words that they would relish an opportunity to kick a offender like out of their space.
They love nothing more than to do that and live out that fantasy they've had in their mind of doing that. They would love it.
I just, like, came to realize, like, oh, like, that could have almost been me. Definitely could have, because I was going around and I started telling people at the bar. So I didn't tell anyone the first day of the conference that I was a trans woman there until the dismissal to the bar at the hotel that everyone was at. And I started talking to Benjamin Boyce, and I talked to a couple other people. There was a dad in particular who was enamored with me because his son had come out as trans and really wanted to, like, probe me for as much advice as I had. And I was happy to help. I'm always happy to help.
Did you tell him it was AGP?
I said he might have a sexuality that goes with this identity, and it has a pattern of behaviors, but it's hard to tell him that, because it's like, is he going to be able to talk to him about it? And it's like, that's the whole thing. It's like, how useful is it for that if they're not open to that explanation? And so, but I did try to frame it in that because he was like, he's not feminine at all, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, well, there is this type of trans woman that is not feminine before transition, but a lot can be expressed after transition. I'm a testimony to that. And, like, so don't think there's no hope or anything. Don't think your son's blowing his life up. Just try to maintain the relationship as best you can and give him opportunities to explain himself in ways that are not forceful, but expansive. So, like, probing questions, or, like, conversational cues that just open up conversation, not bring it down. This was something that was something I told him anyways. But the point is I got talking to quite a number of people, and yes, the reoccurring theme was, can you believe this person is transgender?
Right. Like, they're like, oh my God. Right.
Yes,
like
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, was it Wesley Yang?
Wesley Yang?
Yeah, didn't believe it at first. Asked me a couple of, like, I don't remember, off the wall questions. People ask me all sorts of things there. Because they're so into the subject, I guess.
Right. And he's seen a lot of egregious AGP content in terms of, like, the hate, the anti-AGP propaganda. So
oh yeah,
I'm sure, like, you not fitting, like, you were not fitting his mental model at all.
No, well, I'm pretty sure they all considered me an HSTS. Because
Just based on,
it's
yeah.
I mean, it's just based on again, it's not about what the clinical definition is. It's about what the societal expectation is for that, what that term represents. When it comes to people connecting the dots. And this is where it's like, well, let it be. That's what it is. But hopefully we can get a little bit more expansive and accurate when it comes to understanding that inverted sexualities can manifest in anyone. They occur at like, I guess, a population random or whatever it's called when it's like randomly distributed.
Stochastically?
Yeah, stochastically. Thank you.
Yeah.
I forgot the term. Yeah. Whatever it's called when you forget the term for something. But yeah, I just openly decided to tell them about it because I just felt like the atmosphere was right. At the bar, it was. I had already had a few drinks. That always makes me a little more honest. And honestly, I was having a good time. I was meeting someone, Benjamin Boyce, who I really admired and looked up to for his work on detransitioner narratives, and watched tons of his
Yeah,
interviews.
I've seen so many of his videos. I was glad to finally get to meet him there.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was really enriching. And I thought he told me some really insightful things that I was still thinking about long after the conference. Life is one big test and all sorts of these philosophical things, as Boyce likes to do. Anyways, and then the next day happened. And yeah, and I think, actually, no, that first day was the one where the picture, or was it the second one where the infamous picture?
The second night was the picture.
The second night was the picture.
Yeah.
Because I just remember you talking to Laura about just all sorts of things.
Yeah, I was talking to her for a couple hours.
Yeah. I thought it was like interesting because I stepped by. I remember I was part of the conversation for a little bit, and then I went to the bar because I was like, well, let's see what's going on over there. Yeah, and I didn't think twice of it. I was like, well, this is incredible to see like everyone just kind of getting along until afterwards, and the whole Twitter X controversy happened when Genspect posted your photo.
Yeah, something I did find funny about that photo is like when we were, that area of the conference venue was literally on the margins, that it's like at the outer edge, and then it was like basically all the people that were there that had actually experienced gender issues, or at least like half of them, whereas like all the like outsiders to that were over in the main lobby area.
Yeah,
but yeah, no, I mean, I was talking to Laura for a couple hours. I'd wanted to meet her because I saw some interviews she did, and I was immediately like, that's the autoandrophilic type. I'm always typing like when I see it's because she said she had autism, and that when she transitioned she thought of herself as a gay boy, and like for me that's enough.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's right. There's the gay boy aesthetic is like the driver for the,
well, just that, like, it indicated androphilia. And
okay,
so to me, I'm like, okay, like that means not the homosexual type. And since I think ROGD is hyped and not nearly as common as people think it is, that leaves just the AAP.
Right. Yeah. No, I see that. And I guess, when it came to that whole controversy, it was really eye-opening to me just how much the optics of presentation play into people's judgments and
it's almost everything.
It's almost exactly. It's literally almost everything.
No, it's like what it looks like is what it is.
Shape basically. And I are in the background of that photo, and no one batted an eye. No one would even know. I mean, when I told people I was trans, they were in disbelief, and they just thought, when I asked them, who did you think I was? A concerned mom. That was the number one response. Yeah. And I was like, well, that's not me, but thank you. Like, sure, I'll take it. I mean, that's, the goal sort of for autosexuals.
To be a concerned mom.
To be perceived as female.
Right, yeah.
To be a concerned mom. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I am a concerned citizen. I mean, that is
Yeah.
true. I mean, that's why I'm there. Is I think there's too many, like you said, there's too much ease and affirmation of if you think you're trans, you're probably trans, and then it all just steamrolls from there. And there's this like problem of it's like in the W path issue of the recordings that Benjamin Ryan, the reporter, kind of put out on X, and I think it was just recent, of how like literally when it comes to the care, they're just walking alongside the patient. They're not like they're so afraid of being perceived as gatekeepers that how are you supposed to effectively advise a patient if you're going to just affirm or like gently affirm or try to steer
Right.
them without
If you
like
can only say yes, then like what are you even
yes,
doing?
exactly, right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is the problem. And so that's why I like Genspect, is I think they have a backbone. They're willing to say no. And they're also willing to recognize bodily autonomy when it comes to transition. But what I don't like is I feel like they short sell the transition aspect for the autosexual community.
Right. Yeah, I think they can't acknowledge that it benefits some people. Like they have some mental resistance to the fact that it is the right choice for some people. And my sort of feeling, like something about the conference that bothered me, it wasn't meeting the people. I liked meeting the people, but it was all the talks, it seemed to be more like religious or political in character rather than scientific, where it was
Mm,
almost like they were creating another type of gender ideology that was just going to do battle against the gender identity ideology. Because in only a couple of the talks did anyone even briefly mention autogynephilia, for instance. And like it's already like thoroughly established as the most common cause of male gender dysphoria. And yet everyone at the conference was talking instead about the ROGD boys, when it's like
yeah.
that's not even a thing. I mean, if it is a thing, it's such a small proportion that you should not be talking about that instead of autogynephilia, which is actually what's happening.
Mm,
And yeah,
yeah.
so that's sort of the issue I had with the conference, was that it wasn't suitably scientific, I guess, would be if I were to
Yeah.
say it.
Well, I do think, Phil, you do represent like an exception to like the proclivity for people to make sense of reality through ideology. I mean, and I think that's a good thing. Like, I mean, I'm all about the truth as well. Um, but there with something like gender, there's layers to it. And so it's easy to reframe the phenomenon of autosexuality into more palatable experiences that, I don't know, might legitimize that desire to transition more. And that, I think, is part of what's happening with the ROGD. They don't want it to be sexual, just like I don't want it to be, like, just, like anyone. And so there's just like aversion to that. And you can borrow from all these other ways of thinking, or you see what else is discussed and you frame it that way. Gender ideology, that's how it emerged. And it's like, and it ultimately is trying to get at this essence of femininity within that person, which is basically the only other competing ideology at the end of the day that I see to the typology as to why people could be happy with transition. But I think, and I think that's what I think. So that proclivity to ideology is sort of what was starting to happen at that Genspect conference. And it wasn't born out of any, I don't think out of like, I think, let me put it this way. I think they don't have the blinders on nearly as bad as like WPATH does, where it's
Agreed.
like,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
not nearly as bad.
it's not nearly as bad, right?
Yeah.
But there is sort of there is a begrudging acknowledgement to autosexuality that they will do because it exists, but they don't really, the breadth of it and the extent to which it motivates gender dysphoria and subsequently desire for transition is, I don't see it there. But I also can't really blame them because I don't think there's a lot of um examples to point to like mine where I'm saying, yeah, this fits me and this makes sense. I mean, this is very new on the frontier of not the research itself. It goes back, there's narratives, there's written narratives, but
Right.
when it comes to the expansiveness of how autosexuality persists. I think that is what is not understood.
Yeah, I really feel like we're in the early days of having a good understanding of autosexuality.
Mhm.
And it's unfortunate in the sense that, like, what I've seen so many papers published by, like, the sort of mainstream transgender researchers, and they're almost all completely worthless. Just they don't separate by ideology. They're overtly political. There's so
Mhm.
many things that make it so, like, there's text and figures on the page, but there's no actual substance. And
Yeah.
um uh it bothers me because if all of that sort of the sort of like woke industrial complex or whatever, at least in academia where there's all the progressive research being funded, if even like 10% of that was diverted from into legitimate research like on AGP and AAP, then our knowledge would be going forward so much faster. But like right now we're kind of
Mhm.
reliant on just a few particularly brave scientists like Michael Bailey and Kevin Sue and James Morandini, who are willing to conduct studies that use the appropriate constructs.
Yeah.
It's
The
it's like
politically correct constructs. Yeah.
they're not politically correct, but like they're
Oh,
just
oh, yeah, you're talking about, yeah, the actual
yeah, yeah,
typology constructs,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, but like
Right.
yeah, they're just like yeah, the scientists that are doing the good research, like Michael Bailey and Kevin Sue, the studies aren't even anti-trans. They're just using different constructs. And
Mhm.
I would say they're neutral on trans because they're just trying to find out true things. They're not doing politics. And I really wish there could be more of that research. Because I just think our kind could benefit so much if all the sort of mental energy we spend sort of like spinning our wheels thinking about, you know, just our own gender issues or just autogynephilia theory or whatever, if it could be turned into knowledge that could make it so that we could better predict who would benefit from transition, or like sort of what the most optimal ways are for dealing with it, or sort of what like how clinicians should treat it. Like there's just so much left to be known, and
Mhm.
we're in such an early phase.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Something I would love to see, even though it may be tricky to develop, is a pattern matching or some kind of genetic basis for understanding autosexuality or like sexual orientation from a biological viewpoint, where someone could look at, let's say, a set of genes or some kind of chromosomal sequence, something. I don't know that much about it all, to be honest. Like I'm not a scientist, but I would love to be able to recognize the genetic basis for autosexuality that predisposes someone to gender dysphoria, and like to basically use that as another resource for people in making this decision, to help explain, like, oh yeah, well, your genetic markers line up with this. What are your thoughts on like genetic
But
research for
I
this?
would love for the genetic markers to be isolated if there are discrete genetic markers and it's not just autism genes, you know. But like
True, yeah, that's true.
yeah, but like if there are some alleles that are particularly influential, I would like you said, that would be great to be used in a clinical context for sort of diagnosing gender dysphoria if they genotype the patient and then find that their polygenic score for autogynephilia is really high, then that could
Mm,
serve as another sort of like independent confirmation of the feelings the patient is describing. And I think in terms of dealing with autogynephilia in the future, I think like if it is some genes that are like don't contribute to other positive things. Like my guess is that a bunch of the genes that contribute to AGP are also contribute to intelligence.
Mm.
Just because of it's probably I think a lot of genes that contribute to autism also contribute to intelligence. And
Mhm.
I just if it turns out that there actually are just a few genetic sites that they could genetically engineer out so that people didn't have this, but it didn't cause like other like significant negative effects, I think that would be good to genetically engineer it out.
Ooh.
I know people get
Wow.
people. Well, I mean, I would say overall it brings
Like, I wasn't gonna
suffering.
take it that far, but
No, I'm always willing to go to
yeah.
the genetic engineering phase. I think people are scared of discussing it, but these technologies are
Mm.
coming online very shortly.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the elite are already doing embryo selection with polygenetic screening, and
Wow. Yeah.
and yeah, but I mean, I don't like if it could be phased out in a way where it didn't, you know, harm any individuals tangibly, but just made it so that it arose less often, or when it does arise, it's less severe. I think that would ultimately lead to less suffering, and um, it seems, yeah. I just think it would be a good idea. I know that like people get touchy around the subject of like improving using science to improve like the genes in the population, but
Mhm.
like
Well, let's face
it,
it, people are
yeah,
doing it. I
it
mean
is
I
it
think
is
what is it?
happening,
Down syndrome? That's,
right?
like, become yeah, I know, I've read something
Yeah,
about that recently, and for better or worse, it's what people prefer.
yeah.
Um,
No, it's like people are much more comfortable removing a bad thing, removing a trait they see as bad, than they are as intentionally adding in a good trait. Like when you look at the polling
mm,
on this, people are much more comfortable being, I guess, anti-dysgenic, so to speak, like removing something that causes a tangible harm, versus they're much more wary of introducing something that improves the situation,
right,
you know, or that
right.
confers a benefit, which is like, I to me, I think it's functionally the same thing. Whether you removing a bad thing versus intentionally adding a good thing, you're making it better regardless of like how you're doing it. So I don't see the issue.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah,
I admit I didn't think that far,
you don't have
ahead.
to
I was
opine
just,
on
like,
this. I know it's a spicy.
recogni
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and I think for me, it's just on a tangible note, I know there's been this, like, sort of pioneering work on, your channel, you like to ask this about, like, parents, in particular, like, fathers and then sons and etcetera, like, passing on this genetics for autosexual disposition. Because I am a very strong believer that this is a in utero process that gets cemented and fixed by the time you're at puberty.
Yeah.
Possibly there's some environmental interplay, possibly, but in the early childhood phase, I mean, I'm not expert, but um, I'm not an expert at all. But
I
just
agree
from
that's a born
the
this way thing,
readings,
just broadly.
yes, yeah, it totally reads like that to me. Um, and especially because when you think back like 20, 30 years ago, before the rise of prolific pornography or something, which only is the other thing I've ever seen that anyone really thinks um, has traction in, and it's the gender critical crowd thinks has traction
Right.
in
They
why,
think porn causes
um,
everything.
yeah, basically. But in particular, they do think this. And so
Right.
that's
Even,
why yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
There's like narratives from 100 years ago, but like
Mm-hmm.
back when they couldn't even have smut, basically. Maybe a few people would have like a few saucy pictures, but like it was, this existed before humans had any of these representational technologies.
And then there's that in history, even the Roman emperor. Um, Alegbolus?
like something
I
like a
don't-
galibus or
yeah,
we're thinking of the same guy whose Wikipedia article
yeah,
basically says that, yeah, he wanted to surgically get like a vagina, right?
yeah. He offered like a massive amount of money because he was the emperor to anyone who could do that for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah. So I mean, there's
Right.
evidence in history.
There's signs, you know. There's definitely historical figures where it's like, okay, this is clearly not making their life easier. It's
Hmm.
like it presents difficulties in their life, and yet it gets expressed anyways, and it happens across generations. I think the most likely explanation is that it comes from within.
Right, right. And this has been something I've been a little concerned with for having kids. So part of my transition was I stored a lot of my sperm before ever going on the medical journey of HRT because I knew the risks of, well, the outcome of sterilization that comes from it, prolonged usage. Thank you, trans influencers on YouTube, for proliferating that knowledge and making it very palatable and tangible for me. Because there's many of them that have, talked about this and the emotional impact. And that was something that really resonated with me and helped me understand that I should really be proactive in taking these steps. And so I did, but I'm nervous that in the appreciation that this is a genetic, predisposition or cause, whatever, could I be passing on those genes if I have I guess a male or a female child? I don't want to, who's to say that male is necessarily the cause? If you're out there to prove that there's also autoandrophilia
Yeah, no,
in
I
women,
mean,
it's like,
it,
oh no,
I mean,
double whammy.
there's women that are like trans species or that have gotten limbs amputated because they identify as amputees. So it's like there's
Wow.
the sort of auto thing. Clearly, it happens with females too, in terms of like just them expressing all those other rarer types of trans identity. There's females among them too.
Hmm.
So yeah, no, like yeah, I guess if you had a daughter and then you're like, oh my god, my daughter wants to be a son. You're like,
Oh yeah, that would be, extremely tricky terrain, but I know how I would respond. Very much like no. No, no. Um no.
really?
Yeah, I would put resistance down, but I would do it in a gentle way. I would say you can express all these sorts of ways, but we're going to put the brakes on this as much as possible and really try to isolate um trans affirming messaging to keep that at bay. I just
Right,
don't
just
think it does any help. Yeah. Go
right,
ahead.
yeah. You're basically like saying that you'll sort of like put some of the brakes on, like tell them to like hold on, slow down, like stay away from like whatever trans influencer stuff and just feel it out slowly. Basically like what you did.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it would very much depend on their age and what they explain to me as their reasoning. I think that would go a long way in convincing me, okay, you're a good candidate or not, based on how they're able to articulate what it is they're going through. But in general, especially if it's a female, social, environmental factors, isolate
Right.
first. That's
Yeah.
absolutely. Mhm.
Yeah. Would you if you had a son that like came to you saying that they thought they want to be a girl, like
Oh
would you
God, that would deeply impact me in a horrible way, honestly, because I would just um it's sort of like you said, how like the orientation causes suffering, because it does. I mean, that's what dysphoria is. That's why the medical intervention of transition is helpful. Um, and it's like that would be my first thought, is like, oh no. Um, I would, I mean, I don't know how I would go about like I'm not going to take him to a clinic and do phallometric testing. I'm not going to like go off and go like, I need to know this. Like, I would just leave it to him to sort of be like, look, um, this is the science on this subject, as balanced as possible. And you need to prepare your life for this. Much like I did, where it should motivate you to live better, get a good job, be able to pay for those procedures you're looking to get, because you know you're probably going to need them. Set yourself up for success as much as possible. That applies whether you're autosexual or not, and especially if you are, because it's on you to make that life for yourself. I mean, I was raised that way and I believe that. And so I would give the same advice, but I would try to like help, I don't know, maybe jumpstart their research into their awareness into what's going on if they feel like it resonates with them.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm sure you would know immediately, just like, no son of mine is going to be the homosexual etiology, you know, at least.
Well, you never know. I mean how genetics play out. But I will say this, Phil, one interesting thing that was very opaque, that I don't know if other autosexuals have had this at all, is that when the camera was turned, so my parents would videotape. I actually have this on my transition video. I actually have the footage of it. They would, when they're filming and I would become cognizant that I was being recorded, I would act out extremely femininely. But it was not natural to me. It was like I decided to just be like, I'm a girl, and I would like dance and twirl around as if I was performing for the camera. And my parents teased me over this. I was like, this was before I was like, that was like maybe age 10 to like 8 to 10, somewhere in that like age range, where I do this. But it like, I don't know. I'm not saying I would deploy this as a test on my child, but like, I think there would be cues, like you're saying, there would be cues.
You would be able to tell. You have a strong like AGP DAR, so to speak. Like, you know,
takes one to know one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess we've been going a while, so I think it'd be good. I'll close it out with just one more question. Is is there anything left you felt like you wanted to discuss?
No, I just I would just say, you know, as much as I admire your work for pushing like what I would consider the most scientifically valid explanations for the transsexual origins of transsexualism, I would also say that I think it is best suited for, again, the people making those decisions and the clinicians, and that the broader public will probably always see it. I don't want to say in a negative light, but in a light that is stereotyped to what the gender criticals are really pushing for, which is like the least palatable, most self-obsessed, you know, whatever it is they can do that they are like, oh, that's autogynephilia. I mean, it's still the best insult that you can basically put on a trans woman.
Right.
And so
that's going to keep happening as long as our kind can stay out of the conversation. Like the only way that would change is if we put ourselves out there and stand up for ourselves. Like no one else is going to do it for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, the gender criticals are trying to.
Yeah, no, for sure. And
yeah,
I'm not pleased with how it looks in the short term, but I think if we look back on, say, how the gay rights movement went, there was probably early on, like in the 70s or 80s, I bet a lot of them thought it was impossible, that they would never succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they did in the end.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually pretty optimistic that the auto-heterosexuals will overall succeed, except I hope they don't succeed when they're going overboard in terms of like, say, like the sports thing or whatever. Like there's clear-cut cases where it's like, okay, you can't get what you want here. But
yeah,
I think in terms of adults having access to transition, I'm optimistic that that will be maintained. And that people will overall get less weird about transgenderism.
I think the framing that you introduced in your book goes a long way for helping people talk and make sense of this phenomenon. I don't think autogynephilia will be the framework that sells it outward. I think autoheterosexuality does. At least gets more close to what I would describe as like why I use autosexuality and I don't use the AGP label.
Right. Yeah. And whatever label sticks that maps onto reality, like I don't really care if it's my label or another one. I just want people to start talking in terms of reality. And if
Yeah.
they can use terms that are like sound a little nicer, that's fine. But it's like my priority is always pretty much on the truth angle. So yeah, I guess to close out, I'll ask you the question I ask pretty much everyone is like, what would you say to the AGPs or AAPs in the audience? Like, what would you say to them? Like, what do you want them to know?
To the self-aware community specifically?
Yeah.
Oh.
Or, just, I mean, I assume anyone, even any, like, I would just assume that if they're watching this video, they would likely be part of that,
Yeah.
but you never know.
Right. They're in that typology community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I should have prepared this. I mean, I've heard you
Well,
ask this question so many times in your interviews.
well, I guess put another way, like, what would you have liked to have known?
I have known.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what would I have liked to have known? I guess just know that I mean, I don't want to sound so basic by saying like you're not a bad person. Like it's totally there is a lot of pressure to be dishonest as a trans person, especially a trans woman, of this etiology. And I have to say, like, you need to stay true to you should stay true to yourself, or you'll forget who that is. And you'll become a version of yourself that is worse if you don't hold to what is true. And acknowledging hard realities is a part of that for this type of person. It just is. And it is for some others too. Everyone has their worst elements, but there's something about the autosexual disposition that it looks like your sexual orientation has created your identity. It looks like that. It'll look like that to some people, but the reality is you are so much more than just your sexuality. You are a beautiful, beautiful person that, in my view, as a person of faith, reflects the image of God in ways that we just can't comprehend. And I know that's the religion element, but I do think I think spirituality enriches life in ways that science just will never be able to breach. And that as much as we should strive to keep ideology out of science, there will always be an interplay between the two. And that in order to, I think, best increase the knowledge of this, we need to look for the emotional manifestations that emerge as part of the sexuality and be ready to frame those in discussions with people. That's what I've found works best for me, in a way that stays honest to the fact that there is a sexuality that I have that is not, that I didn't choose. I was born with it. And I can't change it, quite frankly. All I can do is respond to it and manage the feelings and the emotions that come out of it. And so, well, I don't have that was kind of like a soapboxy thing, but I don't have.
No, that was amazing. Don't put yourself down. You crushed it.
Oh, I have a bad habit of doing that. But I don't want to keep rambling, and I feel like I was catching myself rambling. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
Well, it was said beautifully. It's when you listen back to it, you realize you actually did great.
I won't listen. No,
yeah.
I can't stand to hear myself talk.
All right. Well, then take my word for it then.
Okay. Yeah. I will.
Thanks for taking the time to discuss this on my channel, Skyler. I'm sure the audience is gonna love it. And yeah,
I hope so.
It's been a pleasure.
If I can help one person, it was worth it.